In the heart of Moscow, just a 20-minute walk from the Kremlin, at 21 Novinsky Boulevard, was one of the most heavily guarded places in the entire Soviet Union. It was the headquarters of the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States. Located in a small and cramped room on the 7th floor of the American Embassy. On December 7, 1982, two men and two women get into a car in the parking lot of the diplomatic mission. They are closely monitored by a policeman standing at the entrance, who immediately reports what is happening to the State Security Committee. The Soviet Secret Services, who tapped the city telephone lines of the embassy staff, were already aware of the planned celebration on the occasion of the birthday of one of their colleagues. However, they were unaware that two of these men were actually CIA agents, and the party was just a cover for a large-scale and complex operation, codenamed Jack in the Box. Magicians and spies have a lot in common, since the main purpose of both is to distract the observer's attention. In the case of the American agents, their audience was representatives of the KGB. The cars of the Soviet Secret Services, which carried out surveillance, always moved a short distance behind. This meant that when turning onto the next street, the car of the American agents disappeared from view for a short time. It was in those few seconds that something incredible was going to happen. As the American diplomat's car moved through the streets of Moscow, the agent in the front seat was already wearing a typical Soviet pensioner's suit under his outerwear. On the lap of the woman sitting in the back was a cake, which was actually a complex mechanism that looked like a toy with a clown popping out. At about 7 o'clock in the evening, when the car turned onto the right street, the driver slowed down slightly. The door opened, and the agent jumped out of the passenger seat, already completely transformed into a Soviet pensioner. At the same moment, the woman from behind placed the cake in the agent's place, pressed a lever, and a dummy appeared out of the box, imitating the silhouette of an absent colleague. It all happened in a few seconds. The CIA officer in disguise had only taken a few steps along the sidewalk when a KGB surveillance car came around the bend. The Soviet agents saw that there was still 4 people in the car, and it continued to move along the planned route. The illusion worked. However, this was not the end of the operation yet. The CIA agent changed his appearance again, rode in several trams, and walked several streets to make sure that there was no tail behind him. After all, the man he was about to meet was the most valuable agent of the American Special Services in the territory of the Soviet Union, a billion-dollar spy. Spies are almost mythical creatures. Most people have only seen them in feature films, and if it weren't for the rare news about exchanges and agent expulsions, they could safely be put on a par with elves and unicorns. That's why the story we're going to tell you today resembles a portal to the world of spy Narnia. It will have all the usual attributes of films about secret agents: hiding places, hidden cameras, lethal pills disguised in ordinary ballpoint pens, secret signs, the organization of surveillance and the art of avoiding it, disguise, and encrypted messages. But the main thing is that in this case, all this is absolutely documented. The characters have a unique biography, including dates of birth and death. The main character of this story is one of the most successful American intelligence agents in the Soviet Union. Over the years, he supplied the CIA with classified information worth more than $1 billion. And all this was happening in the very center of Moscow, literally under the nose of the State Security Committee. The CIA's intelligence agency was born as a result of a tragedy. In 1941, there was an unexpected Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, which resulted in the death of several thousand American troops and the destruction of dozens of ships. An official investigation by the authorities revealed that one of the key causes of this disaster was poor coordination between various intelligence agencies. To prevent similar incidents in the future, the CIA was created in 1947, the first centralized intelligence service in the history of the United States. Within a few years of its founding, the organization significantly expanded its functionality, and its tasks began to include espionage and covert operations. The office took a leading position on the fronts of the Cold War, where its main opponent was the Soviet Union. The CIA actively collected information outside the USSR, working with refugees, immigrants, Soviet military personnel, and employees of diplomatic missions around the world. However, the Americans were well aware that their most valuable sources of information were located inside the country, and that was a huge problem. The Soviet state tightly controlled the lives of its citizens, which was not very good from the point of view of civil rights and freedoms, but from the point of view of combating foreign spies, it was simply phenomenal. One of the CIA employees in the early 1950s admitted that recruiting an agent with access to important information on the territory of the Soviet Union was almost as difficult as landing spies on Mars. For this reason, the Americans' information about the USSR's military plans was extremely scarce at that time, which was extremely dangerous in the conditions of the Cold War, which could turn into a hot one at any moment. The CIA had only a few really major successes in this area. In the year 1953, in Vienna, an unknown man handed an envelope to an American diplomat. Inside was a letter in Russian written by Major Peter Popov of the Main Intelligence Directorate, who served in Vienna. He offered the Americans cooperation. Over the next few years, Popov became the CIA's most valuable Soviet agent, handing over many classified materials to the Americans, including plans for the Soviet Union to use nuclear weapons in the case of war. In the 58th year, due to suspicions, Popov was urgently summoned to Moscow. After the interrogation, the fact of his betrayal was revealed. At first, the KGB used the spy as a double agent to plant disinformation to the Americans. In the process, Popov managed to send the CIA a short message that he had been discovered. The Soviet court sentenced the spy to capital punishment, and he was shot. In 1961, in Moscow, Oleg Penkovsky, one of the heads of the State Committee for the Coordination of Scientific Research, used his difficult position as a cover. In fact, he was a colonel in the GRU. During numerous business trips abroad, he conducted covert operations to steal Western technology. At one of the receptions for foreign businessmen in Moscow, he handed a letter to a British citizen in which he addressed the American and British authorities. Over the next few years, the newly minted agent handed over 6,000 photographs of secret documents related to the Soviet armed forces to the CIA. These materials played an important role during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Thanks to Penkovsky, the West had a lot of information about the latest developments and the location of Soviet missiles. At the end of 1962, the agent suddenly disappeared. It soon became clear that Penkovsky had come under suspicion from the State Security Committee. A hidden camera was installed in his apartment, and during the search, Western espionage equipment and other evidence of his cooperation with foreign intelligence services were found. The trial of Penkovsky in the 63rd year was public, and the details were widely covered in the Soviet media. In the same year, the spy was sentenced to death and shot. After that, the activities of the Moscow station of the CIA practically stopped for many years. The total number of agents working under the cover of embassy staff did not exceed a few people. The CIA leadership feared that even if they managed to recruit valuable personnel on the territory of the Union, there was a high probability that they would turn out to be fake KGB agents whose purpose was to supply Americans with false information. This version was only confirmed by the story of Peter Popov. This cautious approach persisted until the mid-1970s. There was a generation shift at various levels in the CIA, and younger, more daring employees who sought active action came to replace them.
In January 1977, the head of the Moscow station of the CIA, Robert Fulton, refuels his car at a gas station in the center of Moscow, which we used mainly by diplomats from different countries. At the moment when Fulton gets into the car, a stranger approaches him. A burly man of medium height, about 50 years old, dressed in a coat and a fur hat like millions of Soviet men. The stranger asks in English, "Are you an American? I need to talk to you." Fulton asks what he wants. Then the man suddenly switches to Russian, says, "I'm sorry," hands Fulton a note and quickly leaves. The whole scene lasts no more than 15 seconds. In the note, written in Russian, the author says that he wants to meet with a representative of the American embassy to discuss important things. The message also included a detailed drawing of the meeting plan. The head of the Moscow department of the CIA reads this note in the very room on the 7th floor of the embassy. It was the only place where American agents could feel safe and be themselves. Outside the station, even in the embassy building, they had to act cautiously, following their legend. All the CIA representatives who worked undercover in the USSR were documented as diplomatic employees of the American embassy. Therefore, most of the time they were engaged in standard bureaucratic work. They knew perfectly well that they were being monitored not only outside the diplomatic mission, but also inside, since some of the embassy staff, mostly consisting of Soviet citizens, were leaking information to the KGB. Fulton sends a message about a note and a meeting with a stranger at a gas station to his superiors at CIA headquarters in Langley. The answer comes from there: don't make contact, as it could be a trap. A few weeks later, the stranger approaches Fulton's car again, this time near the building of the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. He holds out a note, which again contains a meeting offer and coordinates, but without additional information. The CIA still decides not to make contact. A couple more weeks pass, and the same man hands the head of the station a new letter, this time more informative. The stranger writes that he understands the Americans' concerns and introduces himself as an engineer working at a closed enterprise related to the defense industry. The man again suggests a new date and meeting place. Fulton, the head of the Moscow station, believes that the contact is not a fake KGB agent. Otherwise, he would not have made so many attempts to convey the message. However, the CIA headquarters remain skeptical. What are the chances that a stranger approached a random car in the parking lot for diplomats and got on the head of the Moscow station? Fulton, on the contrary, believed that it was really an accident and the man simply chose the first car with American license plates. One way or another, the authorities again decide not to make contact. A few months later, Fulton ignores another attempt by the man to give him a package. Such caution at that moment was explained by another factor. Just over the past year, the CIA had lost several valuable Soviet agents, including in the territory of the Soviet Union. The most famous of them was Alexander Ogorudnik, a Soviet diplomat who was recruited while working in Colombia. Ogorudnik loved a luxurious life and agreed to cooperate with the Americans for a generous reward. Shortly after his first contacts in Colombia, Ogorudnik was transferred to a higher position in Moscow, where he continued to cooperate with the CIA. Information was often exchanged through so-called hiding places, special places where a recruited agent left secret documents, photographs, or other important information, and a CIA officer later picked up the package. This scheme also worked in the opposite direction, when the Americans needed to transfer something to the agent. It was a rather old-fashioned espionage practice for that time, but relatively safe, since the CIA representative did not meet with the contact person personally. Nevertheless, in 1977, the KGB arrested an employee of the American embassy while trying to pick up a parcel from Alexander Ogorudnik. This employee really worked for the CIA. It later turned out that Ogorudnik had been detained earlier, and during the interrogation, he managed to swallow a lethal capsule. The embassy employee was declared persona non grata on the day of her arrest and was immediately expelled from the country. This happened to almost all the contacts caught spying. That is, when the operation failed, the CIA suffered double losses. They lost not only the recruited agent, but also their undercover employee. That is why the headquarters of the department reacted so cautiously to the attempts of an unknown man to deliver a letter to an embassy employee. If it turned out at a personal meeting that this was a KGB trap, the CIA would have lost another agent in Moscow without receiving any valuable information. Almost a year passes after the first contact with a stranger at a gas station. The man makes 2 more attempts to send a message to the driver of a car with American license plates at the same gas station. This time he gets to the rank-and-file embassy staff, who pass the letter to the CIA representatives. The stranger acts all in and fully reveals his identity in the message. "I am Adolf Georgievich Tolkachev. I have been working at the Scientific Research Institute of Radio Engineering since 1954. I currently hold the position of chief designer." Both letters are quite voluminous. In them, Tolkachev tells his biography, gives the full names of his wife and 12-year-old son, indicates his home and work phone number, as well as his residential address. In addition, Tolkachev declares his readiness to provide details of the latest radar that he is working on at the Design Bureau. After checking at the CIA headquarters, they decide that the contact can be trusted. He potentially has valuable information, and the agents should meet with him. The new contact is assigned the code name Sphere. In 1976, Soviet pilot Viktor Belenko escaped by flying his MiG-25 interceptor fighter from an airfield in the Far East to Japan and surrendering. Belenko received political asylum in the United States and in exchange provided the Americans with classified information about the latest developments in the field of military fighter jets and radars. Adolf Tolkachev often listened to the Voice of America radio station, one of the few opportunities for Soviet citizens to learn news without government censorship. It was there that Tolkachev heard the story of a defector pilot. In one of his letters to the CIA, Tolkachev wrote in plain text that he would like to do the same thing as Belenko. Among other things, Tolkachev told how the MiG-25 designs were changed after the pilot's escape and was ready to provide information about the latest development in this area, a secret radar for fighters. For a long time, the Soviet armed forces had a significant weak point in the field of radar. Existing designs were very poor at detecting low-flying objects, whether aircraft or missiles. This gave the Americans a serious advantage. Data on such developments strongly influenced the CIA's decision to meet with Tolkachev. The information was extremely important to the Americans. Besides, the KGB would hardly disclose such sensitive facts in a letter just for the sake of catching and expelling another CIA agent. In the Moscow station, Tolkachev is assigned a curator, a CIA officer who works most closely with the agent, including contacting him by phone or meeting in person. John Gill becomes that person. He was born and raised in the United States, and his parents immigrated from Russia after the revolution. As a result, Gill spoke almost perfect Russian, and his slight accent was likely to give away a native of Latvia or Estonia rather than an American. After serving in the army, John accepted an invitation to work for the CIA and ended up in the Moscow residency. Gill becomes the curator of Adolf Tolkachev.
His first priority was to contact the new agent. The CIA had Tolkachev's home number, but they could not simply call from the embassy, as the KGB carefully monitored American diplomats, using wiretaps in apartments, phones, and installing bugs in clothes. CIA officers in Moscow used street payphones to communicate with agents by phone. Gill and his wife had planned a whole operation. The couple had planned a trip to the Bolshoi Theater in advance. During one of the intermissions, Gill left to contact Tolkachev for the first time. At that time, his wife was distracting their Soviet colleague from the embassy who worked for the KGB in the theater. During a short call, a CIA officer greeted Tolkachev and said that the agency had received his letters and would contact him in more detail soon. After that, Gill returned to the auditorium. Their colleague who worked for the KGB did not notice anything. On the next call, the CIA informed Tolkachev of the coordinates where he could pick up the package with detailed instructions. She was waiting for the Sphere agent next to a phone booth on one of the streets, hidden in a work glove. Tolkachev successfully retrieved the package and found in it a detailed guide on how to transfer classified information. In this case, it was a so-called secret letter. The Americans prepared a fake letter for Tolkachev, which was allegedly sent by an American tourist from Moscow to her grandfather in the States. According to the plan, the Sphere agent was supposed to write the secret data known to him on the back of the sheet using specially provided carbon paper and encrypt them in the form of a code. After that, the agent had to send the letter to a fake American address, which actually led to the CIA. The department knew that the KGB would most likely open the envelope for review, as this was a common practice for foreign letters. But the Soviet secret services should not have noticed the encoded text, as it was invisible. And even if it had been discovered, they would not have been able to decipher it, since Tolkachev was provided with a special table for creating the code, which only the CIA had. As a result, a few weeks later, the Moscow residency received Tolkachev's letter with traces of an autopsy, but the secret code was in place. With his help, the Sphere agent revealed data on the latest Soviet developments in the field of some radars, targeting systems, and test results. This information was of great value to Americans. In addition, Tolkachev followed all instructions flawlessly when preparing the message. It's time to meet with him personally to establish closer contact and discuss the terms of cooperation. Personal meetings with an agent on the territory of the Union were a great risk, and in case of failure, it could cause a major diplomatic scandal. However, the CIA was convinced of the need for such a meeting. A Soviet agent in the country with access to secret developments had long been a target of the CIA, and Tolkachev could become an invaluable source. In the late 70s, Adolf Tolkachev turned 50 years old. By Soviet standards, he could be considered a successful man. He held the senior position of chief designer at the Phasotron Bureau at the Research Institute, which worked for the needs of the military-industrial complex. This photo vividly reflects his social status. If the American embassy was located in the center of Moscow, Tolkachev's apartment was located in this high-rise building nearby. Only people who held important positions could get such housing. One of the first questions John Gill asks in person concerns Tolkachev's motivation. What prompted you to take such a risk? At first, he tries to avoid a direct answer, saying that this is a difficult question that will take a lot of time. In the end, he simply replies that he's a dissident by nature. Then they move on to discuss the financial issue. Tolkachev again refers to the case of pilot Belenko and says that he would like to receive the same amount from the United States as he did. Gill replies that he's not aware of Belenko's remuneration and hands him 1,000 rubles, saying that the CIA is ready to pay this amount monthly. Tolkachev is asking for 10,000, but both amounts are quite insignificant given the potential risks. In his position, the chief designer of the closed enterprise received more than 300 rubles a month, which was several times higher than the average salary of a Soviet engineer. Tolkachev later admits that he needs the money more as an element of recognition. In conditions of constant shortages, even in the capital, many goods were simply not possible to buy. The agent hands Gill a notebook where he wrote down a new portion of secret data. He immediately mentions that if the CIA had provided him with a camera, he would have been able to photograph documents, for example, at the end of the working day when colleagues left the office. It was difficult and time-consuming to rewrite and redraw detailed diagrams. Tolkachev and Gill spent about 40 minutes together walking through the empty, dark streets of Moscow in January. Following the meeting, the CIA representative wrote to his superiors that the new agent had taken a responsible approach to the case and expressed his willingness to continue cooperation. The CIA develops a special plan for the next meetings. They choose a few dots near Tolkachev's house so that he can leave the house under the pretext of walking. Each dot had a Russian name, for example, Valera or Nina. First, the CIA officer calls Tolkachev's home number and asks for Valera. Tolkachev should reply that the caller has gotten the wrong number and hang up. Then he leaves the house to meet with the curator at a point called Valera. During the next few meetings, the Sphere agent continues to provide the CIA with valuable information. For example, essential details of the design and systems of the latest Cu-27 fighter. The CIA agrees to provide Tolkachev with a miniature camera and half the amount he requested, 5,000 rubles. However, the requests of the Sphere agent are growing rapidly. At the next meeting, he asks the CIA to provide him with a poison capsule in case of capture, and also significantly increases the financial requirements. Now he's asking for an amount with 6 zeros, which is millions of dollars. Allegedly, it was about such a reward that the Voice of America radio station reported to pilot Belenko. The new requirement is certainly becoming a problem for the CIA. A poison capsule for a relatively new agent is a big risk. What if he panicked and used it in a non-threatening situation? In addition, if the capsule is somehow discovered by the authorities, it will immediately arouse unequivocal suspicions.
The hundreds of thousands of dollars Tolkachev was asking for was an impressive sum. The cost of $1 in the USSR at that time was estimated at about a few rubles, of course on the black market, since there was no free purchase and sale of currency at that time. And firstly, the Moscow residency needed to prove to the authorities at Langley that the new agent was worth the money. And secondly, there was a logistical question. Where would Tolkachev keep them? Will he be able to spend them without arousing suspicions? As a result, the CIA has so far decided not to transfer the poison capsule to the Sphere agent, but agrees to his financial terms. After analyzing the data provided by Tolkachev, the Americans realize that they will be able to save tens of millions of dollars for their military-industrial complex. With information about Soviet developments, the United States can properly allocate the resources of its military-industrial complex. In addition, Tolkachev followed all instructions flawlessly when preparing the message. It's time to meet with him personally to establish closer contact and discuss the terms of cooperation. Personal meetings with an agent on the territory of the Union were a great risk, and in case of failure, it could cause a major diplomatic scandal. However, the CIA was convinced of the need for such a meeting. A Soviet agent in the country with access to secret developments had long been a target of the CIA, and Tolkachev could become an invaluable source. In the late 70s, Adolf Tolkachev turned 50 years old. By Soviet standards, he could be considered as a successful man. He held the senior position of chief designer at the Phasotron Bureau at the Research Institute, which worked for the needs of the military-industrial complex. This photo vividly reflects his social status. If the American embassy was located in the center of Moscow, Tolkachev's apartment was located in this high-rise building nearby. Only people who held important positions could get such housing. One of the first questions John Gill asks in person concerns Tolkachev's motivation. What prompted you to take such a risk? At first, he tries to avoid a direct answer, saying that this is a difficult question that will take a lot of time. In the end, he simply replies that he's a dissident by nature. Then they move on to discuss the financial issue. Tolkachev again refers to the case of pilot Belenko and says that he would like to receive the same amount from the United States as he did. Gill replies that he's not aware of Belenko's remuneration and hands him 1,000 rubles, saying that the CIA is ready to pay this amount monthly. Tolkachev is asking for 10,000, but both amounts are quite insignificant given the potential risks. In his position, the chief designer of the closed enterprise received more than 300 rubles a month, which was several times higher than the average salary of a Soviet engineer. Tolkachev later admits that he needs the money more as an element of recognition. In conditions of constant shortages, even in the capital, many goods were simply not possible to buy. The agent hands Gill a notebook, where he wrote down a new portion of secret data. He immediately mentions that if the CIA had provided him with a camera, he would have been able to photograph documents, for example, at the end of the working day when colleagues left the office. It was difficult and time-consuming to rewrite and redraw detailed diagrams. Tolkachev and Gill spent about 40 minutes together, walking through the empty, dark streets of Moscow in January. Following the meeting, the CIA representative wrote to his superiors that the new agent had taken a responsible approach to the case and expressed his willingness to continue cooperation. The CIA develops a special plan for the next meetings. They choose a few dots near Tolkachev's house so that he can leave the house under the pretext of walking. Each dot had a Russian name, for example, Valera.
The first experience of using the secret camera, Molly, was unsuccessful. After the development, the CIA realized that Tolkachev had taken the pictures in an insufficiently illuminated place, which was why nothing could be seen in the photos. After that, Tolkachev was given one of the latest developments, the Troll camera, the size of a finger battery, as well as a regular Pentax camera as a backup. During the 79th year, Gill meets with Tolkachev 5 times. For Gill, every meeting meant a complicated operation. The KGB was well aware that some of the embassy staff worked for the CIA, and often they even guessed who it was. Surveillance was an integral part of the life of the Moscow station staff. Before meeting Tolkachev, Gill had to make sure every time that he was able to evade surveillance. To do this, a CIA officer, for example, could fly from the Soviet Union ostensibly on a business trip abroad, but then return to Moscow unexpectedly earlier than expected. While the information from the border guards reached the KGB, Gil had literally a few hours to meet with the agent without surveillance. Masking and other methods were also often used. Every CIA employee received special training in this area. These precautions helped the CIA to safely meet with Agent Sphere. In general, Americans tried to use face-to-face meetings as little as possible to transmit information. But in this case, the initiative came from Tolkachev. Personal contact was important to him, and the CIA was increasingly willing to meet him halfway, given the growing value of the agent. With the use of cameras, Tolkachev's productivity has increased significantly. He brought hundreds of sheets of secret notes and hundreds of tapes with photographs of documents and diagrams to meetings. These included top-secret radar developments for the MiG-25 aircraft, information on the state of missile defense, and strategic documentation on the development of specific systems on military aircraft up to 1999. Tolkachev was aware of his own value to the CIA. Gil had already brought him impressive bundles of cash to meetings, which contained more than 100,000 rubles. But the Sphere agent raises the price again. He says he made a mistake last time, and he doesn't need a six-figure sum, but a sum with 6 zeros. That's millions already.
This fact, without exaggeration, caused a stir at the CIA headquarters in Langley. No agent in the history of the series has ever received such a reward. After much discussion, the CIA agreed. They were willing to pay $200,000 at the same time and then pay $300,000 a year. The reason for this decision was simple. They understood that Adolf Tolkachev was worth the money. The data he provided will be relevant for the next 8 to 10 years. At the beginning of the 80s, experts from the United States Air Force estimated that classified information from the Sphere agent was worth about $1 billion. Adolf Tolkachev officially became a billion-dollar spy. Forbes magazine was not published in the USSR. Forbes magazine did not publish lists of the highest-paid spies. Forbes magazine could not write that the chief designer of one of the Soviet bureaus, Adolf Tolkachev, had a higher income than the President of the United States. The 70s and early 80s in the USSR are commonly referred to as the era of stagnation. One of the main questions was not how to make money, but where to get it. In conditions of constant shortages, Tolkachev could hardly physically spend the entire amount that the CIA paid him. He simply stored most of the rubles he received at home on the mezzanine, where neither his wife nor his son looked. Tolkachev received the goods from the Americans that were difficult or impossible to obtain in the Soviet Union. Books by dissidents that were not printed in the country, good shaving machines, French medicines, Czech stationery, records of Western rock bands for his son, and other things. Part of the money from Tolkachev's salary went to a special foreign bank account. The CIA suggested that the Sphere agent think about the possibility of escape. And although at first he did not consider this option seriously, he gradually began to think about this possibility. However, it is worth noting that it was not about immediate departure. Firstly, the Americans were interested in a valuable agent providing information for as long as possible. And secondly, in 1980, KGB Major Viktor Shaimov and his wife and daughter secretly crossed the border between the USSR and Finland. They were hidden in a car by CIA officers and then transported to the United States. A year earlier, a young officer, Shaimov, disillusioned with the Soviet system, contacted the CIA in Moscow. His initial condition for cooperation was to escape to the States. After the successful removal of Shaimov, the KGB believed for several months that their officer and his family had become victims of ordinary crime and therefore disappeared. This story proved that it was possible to organize the export of a valuable agent from the Soviet Union. After Shaimov's escape, the Tolkachev's handler was David Rolfe, an experienced agent in his 30s. One evening, in October 1980, David Rolfe and his wife entered the building of the American Embassy in Moscow. A policeman at the entrance recorded their arrival. Rolfe immediately went to a technician's room, where he changed his clothes, applied makeup, and looked like one of the embassy's techies. Such ordinary KGB officers were monitored significantly less than potential CIA agents. David Rolfe left the building in a new guise and acted in accordance with the techniques and rules he had learned during his training. He rode a tram, went into a flower shop, boarded a bus, walked down the street, and all the while carefully examined the cars driving nearby, other passengers and passers-by. At the very end, he ran into one of the entrances and quickly climbed the stairs to provoke potential representatives of the State Security Service to run after him. He waited on the stairs for a while. Everything was quiet. The whole operation to confuse the tracks lasted about an hour and a half. Finally, at 9 o'clock in the evening, Rolfe arrived at the appointed place for his first meeting with the Sphere agent. After getting to know each other, they moved on to discussing issues. Rolfe informed Tolkachov that his request for a poison capsule had finally been granted and he would receive it at one of his next meetings. Before that, the spy had persistently asked the CIA for this, but the management was repeatedly refused. One of the reasons for the change in position was increased risks of the Sphere agent's activities. The fact is that when receiving secret documents from the repository of the Research Institute, the employee signed a special form. The problem was that on his own initiative and at the request of the CIA, Tolkachov had already taken many documents that had nothing to do with his direct activities at the Bureau. If the KGB had decided to change the forms, everything would have become obvious and Tolkachov would be arrested immediately. In addition, the security rules at the Research Institute had changed. Now, when receiving documents from the vault, an employee had to leave a pass there. But a pass was also required to enter the building. That is, the Sphere agent could no longer take the documents to the vault, hide them under his coat, go home for a lunch break, take pictures of the documents there, and return to the institute. At the meeting, Tolkachov told the curator that he had found a way out by enlisting the help of an acquaintance in the vault who agreed to give him documents without a pass. When asked by the CIA officer if this was dangerous, Tolkachov replied philosophically, "Everything is dangerous." The Moscow residency decided to prepare a duplicate of his pass for the agent, but it took time. Meanwhile, Tolkachov continued to take risks. In 1981, the Sphere agent was exposed, but it was not the KGB or the Institute's leadership who did it, but his own wife. Tolkachov's wife, Natalia, found a camera and several other devices from the CIA at home. Tolkachov forgot to remove the evidence after another photo shoot of the documents at lunch. The wife immediately realized that her husband was engaged in espionage. Tolkachov did not deny it and confessed to working for the CIA. Natalia pointed out that he was endangering her and her son and asked him to stop his espionage activities. Tolkachov lied and promised that he would finish soon. At the moment when Natalia discovered the spy equipment on his husband's desk, she hardly suspected that the Sphere agent appeared in many ways thanks to her. Natalia's maiden name was Kuzmina. Her father, Ivan Kuzmin, was the editor of the industrial newspaper Light Industry, and his wife, Sofia, was born into a family of Ukrainian Jews. Her father later moved to Denmark, where he was quite successful in business. Sometimes her daughter visited him in Europe. Shortly after another trip, in the 37th year, she was arrested by Soviet intelligence officers. At the height of Stalin's repressions, having a close relative in a capitalist country was reason enough for suspicion. As a formal accusation, Sofia was charged with participation in the Trotskyist community. A week later, her husband Ivan was arrested. Sofia was shot a few months later, and Ivan was sent to camps for 10 years. Their 2-year-old daughter, Natalia, ended up in an orphanage. Ivan Kuzmini was released in 1947 and died in the mid-50s, a year after his rehabilitation. Shortly before his death, Ivan told his daughter what really happened to him and his wife. Tolkachov knew that his wife had read Samizdat, that she had refused to sign a letter at work in support of the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968 and had no warm feelings for the Soviet system at all. He also knew the history of her family, and this became one of the main motives for his cooperation with the CIA. The future spy himself was born in the late 1920s in Kazakhstan. In his early childhood, his family moved to Moscow. After graduating from the Polytechnic Institute, he was assigned to the Radio Technicians Research Institute, known as Fazatron, which became his only place of work. He was not active in politics, but he read banned literature, followed famous dissidents such as Sakharov, Solzhenitsyn, and listened to Voice of America radio. The desire to damage the Soviet system grew in him gradually. After the famous story with pilot Belenko, Tolkachev realized that his main weapon against the Soviet Union were secret documents, diagrams, reports, and other important information about the military industry. In one of his letters to the CIA, he confessed that he had never been to the United States and was far from romanticizing this country, but he had the impression that he could live there. Therefore, he decided to supply classified data specifically to the Americans.
In 1982, the leadership of the CIA's Moscow station changed. The new authorities relied on the so-called deep cover agents. As a rule, the cover for the CIA officers was the usual diplomatic work and routine tasks of the embassy. Deep cover agents came as maintenance personnel. The KGB initially kept less track of such people. Besides, for some time after arriving in Moscow, the agents led a monotonous life: work, shop, house, and once a week on Sunday, an ice rink. Thus, the Soviet secret services lost all interest in them. In addition, the deep cover agents were always new recruits. They did not work in residencies in other parts of the world, so the KGB had no information on them. It was with such CIA officers that Tolkachev now met. Despite the fact that he was provided with a special radio transmitter to communicate with Americans from a distance, he still insisted on face-to-face meetings. Therefore, CIA agents held meetings with the Sphere agent on the street or in his Zhiguli, which Tolkachev had recently bought. Despite the increased security measures at the Institute, he still managed to supply the CIA with hundreds of valuable photographs of documents and diagrams at almost every meeting. However, in the middle of the 82nd year, something strange happened. Tolkachev missed several meetings, and several more meetings were disrupted due to suspicions of KGB surveillance. Finally, the agents called Tolkachev's home, but no one answered the phone. Tension was building in the Moscow station. There had been no news from the CIA's most valuable spy for several months. In early December, another meeting with Tolkachev was scheduled to take place. This time, in order to avoid KGB surveillance for sure, the Moscow station prepared an operation called Jack-in-the-Box. The CIA officer managed to evade prosecution and finally meet with Tolkachev. He apologized, explaining that he had been feeling unwell lately due to high blood pressure and was therefore out of schedule. However, he still brought with him a lot of recordings and tapes with photographs of secret documents. By the beginning of the 83rd year, the CIA had a plan ready to take Tolkachev and his family to the States. However, Tolkachev himself eventually abandoned this plan. He talked about his friends who emigrated to Israel and wrote about homesickness. Tolkachev realized that he could not live in another country or even in another city, so the escape plan was no longer considered. This was, in a sense, positive news for the Americans. Their valuable agent continued to work. In the 83rd year, Tolkachev was called to his superiors to discuss a routine issue. At that moment, a bell rang in the office. From the conversation, Tolkachev realized that on the other end of the line was the head of the Institute's security service, who reports directly to the KGB. He asked to prepare a list of people who worked on a certain type of radar. Tolkachev passed information about this very radar to the CIA just a month ago. Horrified, he returned to his office, wondering how the KGB had found out about this. Perhaps there was a mold in the CIA, or one of his colleagues at the Institute suspected him. Anyway, Tolkachev took sick leave the next day. In a hurry, he collected bundles of cash, cameras,
a CIA transmitter, dissident books, threw his belongings into a Lada, and drove out of town. There he burned the evidence and scattered the metal parts from the car on the way to Moscow. The next day, before going to the chief's office, Adolf Tolkachev took a poison capsule out of his pen and put it under his tongue. He was sure that KGB officers would be waiting for him there. However, it turned out to be just another routine issue. Over the next few weeks, Tolkachev put a capsule under his tongue every time he went to his superiors, and also took poison to every meeting with the CIA and when he took documents out of the Institute. Weeks and months passed, but there was no news about the outcome of the KGB investigation at the Institute. It is also unknown what the investigation was related to. One thing was for sure: by all means, Adolf Tolkachev did not intend to surrender alive. In the late 70s, Edward Lee Howard worked for a consulting firm in Chicago. He was 28 years old, and he wanted to change his life and see the world, so he applied to the CIA. He passed the training, all the necessary tests, and was accepted. In the 82nd year, he received a job offer at the Moscow residency. Before being sent, Howard underwent training, which partially involved access to documents from the Moscow branch of the CIA. That is, he probably came across the code name of the agent Sphere. Whether he knew Tolkachev's real name is unknown. Shortly before leaving for Moscow, Howard failed a polygraph test. The same thing happened with several repeated tests. They found out that Howard had withheld information about minor offenses in the past. To this was added the already known information about his problems with alcohol. As a result, Edward Lee Howard was not only suspended from his appointment to the Moscow station, but also completely dismissed from the CIA. Before his discharge, he signed a paper in which he pledged to keep secret all information received during his service. However, Howard was angry. During a trip to Europe, he contacted representatives of the Soviet embassy and agreed to provide them with classified information for $60,000. Among this information was information about a valuable agent insider research institute that worked for the military-industrial complex. It was clear that even without knowing the agent's specific name, the KGB would be able to identify the spy. It was only a matter of time. In 1984, despite increasing health problems and fear of an investigation at the Institute, Tolkachev continued to provide the CIA with crucial data. Now he often did not take documents out of the building and took pictures in the toilet of the Institute. Due to poor lighting, many of the shots turned out to be defective, but the information of the Sphere agent was still of great value. On one of the meetings, a CIA officer informed Tolkachev that an amount of almost $2 million had accumulated in his foreign bank account. In early March 1985, Tolkachev was supposed to have another meeting with a CIA officer, but Tolkachev did not come. For several months, the Americans left signals about new meetings, but Tolkachev did not appear again. The next meeting, scheduled for early June, was canceled by the CIA due to increased surveillance by the KGB. A few days later, on the weekend, Tolkachev and his wife went out of town. On their way back, their car was stopped by traffic police officers. Tolkachev took the documents and left. At the moment when he was approaching the inspector, several people ran up to him, grabbed him, and carried him to an official car parked nearby. None of these people were employees of the traffic police officers. They were all KGB officers. On the eve, the Soviet Secret Services conducted a search in Tolkachev's apartment. There they found cameras, a receiver, money, a poison capsule, recordings, in short, everything that clearly indicated Tolkachev's work with Western intelligence services. A week later, the CIA agent went to another scheduled meeting with Tolkachev. After making sure that he wasn't being followed, the agent arrived at the scene. He saw Tolkachev's familiar Lada. As the agent approached the car, several burly men ran out of the ambush, put him in a car, and took him to Lubyanka for interrogation. The CIA officer was found to have secret cameras, wads of cash, and other evidence that suggested he was more than just a diplomat. On the same night, he was declared persona non grata and exiled from the country. The Moscow station immediately realized that if the KGB knew about the exact time and place with the meeting with Tolkachev, that meant only one thing: the story of the billion-dollar spy was over. In August 1985, a Soviet KGB officer in Rome surrendered to the American authorities. Among other things, he talked about a valuable source of information for the Soviet secret services, known by the codename Robert. This agent was a former CIA employee who was preparing to be transferred to the Moscow residency, but failed the tests and was fired. People connected to the Soviet branch of the CIA had no doubt that it was Edward Lee Howard who had given up information about Tolkachev. The FBI questioned Howard, who denied everything. He was released, but round-the-clock surveillance was established. Nevertheless, Howard managed to leave his home unnoticed, fly out of the country, get to Europe, and then get to the Soviet Union, where he received asylum. In the 90s, he would write a memoir in which he would deny his involvement in the capture of Tolkachev. In the early 2000s, 50-year-old Howard would die from a fall in his Moscow apartment. In the 86th year, Adolf Tolkachev was sentenced to capital punishment. On the eve of the shooting, he was allowed to see his son. Tolkachev apologized to him. His son replied that his father had nothing to apologize for. In October 1986, the state-run TASS news agency announced that Adolf Tolkachev had been shot for espionage and treason. Tolkachev's wife, Natalia, was sentenced to 3 years in prison for knowing about his actions but not informing law enforcement agencies. In 1987, she was released and returned to Moscow. In March of 91, Natalia died of cancer. In December 91, the Soviet Union collapsed.